What's happening, people? Welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time to this channel. I'm discussing modernism and postmodernism in this two-part series, the destruction of the world and the destruction of reality, respectively. Beginning chronologically with modernism, I'm going to discuss what it was, how we should conceive of it, what brought it about or why it existed, and what ended it, or why we no longer find ourselves in the modern era, why we find ourselves in the postmodern era. So let's discuss. My name is Lex, and you could call me a philosopher or even a guru because I teach people how to perform existential rehab on themselves. But I simply consider myself a communicator and a student in the art of living well in an unwell world. Welcome to my channel. So what is modernism? What is this period lasting from roughly 1880, 1890 to 1950, 1960? What is a modernist? What is it about? Well, to put it simply, modernism is about new. Get rid of the old, destroy the old, create new. It doesn't really matter what the old was. The old must go, new must be had. That may be a defining principle of modernism. You can see this in modern art, modern literature, new ways of being, new ways of expressing, almost an intentional diversion from anything that existed before, a challenging of what can be, a challenging of what is right and what is considered real and true. This is modernism. But it wasn't relegated to arts and literature. It extended to science, philosophy, mathematics, political theory, economic theory, social sciences, pretty much every intellectual discipline that you can imagine, every aesthetic discipline that you can imagine, every area of modern life. And this was the name of the game for that entire period, but really increasingly so around the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s as more information, more things developed, more understanding was had by the general populace. So what we see here in the modern period, in modernity, is an attempt to destroy the old world, an attempt to destroy the authority, the orthodox, the structures, the institutions, the rigidity of the world that people lived in that did not allow people to flex, bend, be natural, organic, living beings, be whatever they believed themselves to be or wanted to be. It was a challenging of the status quo in pretty much every area that could be thought of, sometimes just to challenge, not necessarily a goal in mind other than to prove that what was didn't have to be. This is modernism. This is the way things developed and took place. Things like math and science really benefited from the modern way of thinking, modernity, modernism, because it was a challenging of what existed before in a way that wasn't really allowed, wasn't really possible. And a lot of new breakthroughs, a lot of new perspectives and insights and understandings about this universe, the world, physical reality were had. The reason that progress was made so effectively is because there were limiting, confining, constraining parameters on these disciplines. Unlike music, unlike art, where everything was challenged, new ways of doing things completely were had, and old ways were completely thrown out. No longer was there an adherence to forms like it was previously known in the Victorian period and the periods before, an attempt to replicate or to mimic and display what we experienced with our senses, with our eyes, an objective world. No longer was it an attempt to represent anything external. It was an attempt to represent something internal, an attempt to represent the subjective solely. It was a shift from the objective, from an external shared world to an internal subjective world, a personal world, an individual experience, an individual reality. Pretty much every period before the modern era was focused on a world at large. We existed in a true and real world. There was a narrative, and this is the old world, a narrative about who people are, what they are, what things are true, what things are not true, what things are allowable, what things are possible, who can say what can be and who can say what can't be done, who has authority. There was a challenging of all of that. Art and literature did not have the same rigidity and structure that the sciences and logic did. So they were challenged the most emphatically, the most directly, and the most successfully. So what we saw was an abandonment of structure, of form, of adherence to rules and norms in an attempt to push the envelope on what actually could be considered art. That was actually a goal of many people, and not necessarily a wrong goal within the context, within the motive and the objective of the modernist. So whatever existed, whatever painting of a landscape, whatever portrait, whatever sunset that was held up in the highest regard, whatever statue was held up as the epitome of art, of aesthetic perfection, that was seen as too narrow, too static, too rigid to be anything but a block, a wall, an obstacle toward a better truth, toward a better reality, toward a better experience in a better world. So people started to push the envelope on what could be considered art. People started to try to put things out there and see if you could make an argument against it being art. What is art? Who's to say? Who's to define what is and what isn't? What fits within this category, within this term, within this definition, and what doesn't? Well, we can find no one, so we'll do what we want. And anytime you try to say, well, this is the line, this is the boundary, we're going to push beyond it. The same thing happened in literature. You saw people previously throughout human history, for the most part, writing narratives. People told stories about things that people did and things people didn't do, said, achieved, and failed at. Now you have people, thanks to Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, turning inward, looking at the self, the internal experience, and trying to express that through literature. So people are trying to talk about what it's like to be them, what it's like to be a human being in a certain place and space and time, going through certain circumstances and conditions, experiencing certain things in a way that had nothing to do with the larger narrative of a story. It was the story of you, only a story that you could tell because it's only a story that you can know, or only a story that the character could tell, or someone with a godlike view into the character's mind and heart could know. Previously, all of the characters in literature were closed vessels. You could not see inside of their mind. They spoke what they spoke. A narrator described what their motive was or whatever, but you never really heard what they thought and what they felt unless they said it out loud. So this was a new way of doing and being pretty much universally, and that was modernism. New for the sake of new. Why was it new for the sake of new? Because what existed before was abruptly, unequivocally, and irrevocably seen as bad, as the problem. People, in a sense, woke up to the world and saw the world that existed as the cause of much of human suffering globally. And their emotional reaction in many ways was simply to tear down the world that was causing us to hurt. It was an emotional reaction by humanity in a sense. It was an attempt to say that we know this isn't it, this can't be it, because look what's happened to us. But what brought this about? How do people get here? How do people go from a static and rigid world that never really evolved or changed in terms of dominance and hierarchy? Maybe some merchants rose up, but the structure of society and civilization was pretty much intact. In the disciplines of science, mathematics, art, all of the higher pursuits of humanity were closed. The physical sciences even were limited in what people thought could be done, what people thought could be had, and what people thought could be known. As far as they were concerned, Newton solved it all. Michelangelo did it all. Mozart played it all, composed it all. It was done. The world was done, and you either met these standards, these criteria, these objectives, these ideals, or you didn't. And that's all there was. Well, now, there was a new way of being because of a number of events that we're all aware of that we don't necessarily associate with an inevitable destruction of a rigid, static, and really unevolved world. So what actually happened? What catalyzed this period in human history, human development? Why would a modernist want to destroy the world that supported them, even if they didn't agree with it? Why would anyone take this approach instead of just simply improving the world that they lived in, furthering it, helping it get better? Well, simply, they didn't think it could. They saw a world that was so broken, so wrong, so unevolved, so static and rigid and so disconnected, cold and unfeeling. They simply assessed that it needed to be deconstructed, destroyed, dismantled, and done away with. And that's exactly what they set out to do. They tried to destroy everything that existed, challenge everything in their path, in their awareness. People woke up. People gained knowledge, they gained information and a deeper and better understanding of themselves, the world they lived in, and the reality that supported them. They could no longer accept many of the rigid paradigms that had existed before that were now incongruent with the world that they knew to actually exist. Think science. Think a shift from Newtonian physics to quantum physics. Blame Einstein if you want. Blame Bohr, blame Heisenberg, blame all of these people for destroying the world in a sense. There were really three aspects of this development in human understanding, human history, that pushed this forward the most. They were the awareness, the understanding, the investigation of the internal state of the human psyche, the human mind, validity being given to this inner universe, this inner realm. That was a huge one. Then there was a shift from a Newtonian view of the universe to an Einsteinian view of the universe, and a quantum mechanical view post-Einsteinian. And there was an increase in technological capability, an increase in know-how. There was an increase in might, efficiency, and a greater ease of sharing and acquiring information. All of these things played a part, a major part. The importance of the individual being put to the forefront of the world, of our awareness, of our goals, of our motives. No longer are we supporting a world that is more right and more important than us. Now we're trying to actualize and realize things for ourselves and understand ourselves, because we are the point. We realize that there's some significance to us, that there's complexity and depth to us, to our experience, that cannot be ignored, that shouldn't be ignored, that should be expressed or at least understood. We gained an understanding of this physical universe, and we no longer saw ourselves as mechanistic automatons. We saw ourselves as impossibly complex subatomic creatures in a reality that we no longer understood. Most people didn't understand what this meant, as we still don't in a general fashion. However, understanding that this was out there, that an atom existed, and that was a core building block, and then to have that uprooted and to discover the atom was not a core building block, a fundamental particle of reality, a fundamental piece of this existence, that it itself contained more fundamental parts of reality, which all could be surmised in an equation of quantum mechanics. All of this undermined the solidity, the validity, the realness of the old world, and gave people plenty of reason, justification, and motive to assail what was, what had been. It was impossible to resist. And then you couple that with the literal increase in human capability. I can do more myself. I can now travel from here to there with much greater ease. Now I can calculate. Now I can move things with greater ease. Now we're not using beasts of burden. We have steam power. Now we have electricity everywhere, electric motors, gasoline. Things like this are changing the world and changing the way people viewed themselves, viewed their world and what was possible, and they demanded more. They demanded more abruptly once something else affected the world. That was World War I. Once this war took place, people saw what brought us to this state of suffering and abject agony as a species. Millions of people dying in the most unnecessary fashion possible, being marched toward machine guns, simply because the powers that be believed in a static, rigid way of doing things. There was a right way to fight a war and there was a wrong way. And an inability to update war strategies, tactics, things like this led to millions of people suffering and dying in ways that were unconscionable, unreasonable, irrational. People seeing this, people hearing about this, started to look at the powers that be like, how could you bring us to this state where this is happening? This can't be right. What is this about? What is this war about? Look at what people are going through. Our men and women are dying. Our sons and daughters, our mothers and fathers in many cases are dying. Everybody is suffering. This is pointless. And why are we here? It's not because there's a lack of resources. It's not because there's any moral fight that we're in. It's simply because the powers that be decided to put us in this situation. When you see your leaders, when you see your military generals, when you see your admirals, people that were previously unassailable in their position of authority, do things that just literally defy logic, defy sense and reason. You question whether or not anyone in a position of authority has the right or the objectivity or the know-how, the knowledge, the understanding to tell you what it should be and what it shouldn't be. Maybe everything's up for grabs. Maybe everything is in question. And it was, ultimately. As each decade went by, every year, every month, a new discovery, a new development, a new way of doing something, a new way of being was had. People became emboldened and people realized that, yes, it is in question. Maybe I should be the authority. Maybe I am the authority because you have obviously not seen something, because we have arrived at this state. We are here now. And no one that is in a position of authority that should be there could bring us here without realizing it, without understanding what they were doing. You're blind. You're just following the pattern. You're following the plan. without even thinking, and that will no longer work. We need to think, we need to wake up because we have new information. These stories no longer hold, these narratives no longer fit. They're running up against reality, they're running up against science, running up against evidence, running up against what we know, what we experience internally. So when we're told that we don't matter, our internal state doesn't matter, it's about a narrative. It's about the external world. It's about form adhering to a standard. Well, who set that standard? Who says I don't matter? I really think people just lost their religion and they lost their world. They lost their reality and they woke up to a world that wasn't permanent, wasn't solid, wasn't static, wasn't rigid and true as they thought it was, and they wanted to tear it down. It was an emotional reaction. We don't find ourselves in modernity. We don't find ourselves in the modern era. We find ourselves in postmodernity. We have destroyed modernism in that whole endeavor because it was doomed from the get-go. In the way it was realized, structured, and executed, it was always going to fail. When you have no objective other than to destroy what exists and replace it with something new, you're eventually going to create the new guard, the new authority, the new structure. And that will need to be destroyed and assailed by yourself or someone else. So nothing can stand. Nothing will be able to stand because nothing will be allowed to stand in this way of being, in this way of thinking. Modernism was always going to chew itself up. Modernism was going to turn itself into dust, always, because there is no stated objective. You have no place to land, no way to know that you've arrived, no way to know that this is good, this should stand. Some things should stand. The Victorian world clearly was not all bad, or people would not have been able to exist in the way that they were. Good things came out of pretty much every period in human history. So a blind and blanket universal rejection of what's existing is not an intelligent way of going. You should question everything, should challenge everything, but some things will stand the test of questioning. Some things will stand a challenge because they are more real and true than many other things. Modernism could have been saved with just one change in their approach, and that is to create a goal, to create an objective that is shared universally. Not just get rid of the old, create the new, but an actual objective that can be realized and known. One that I would suggest, the only one that would have made sense in my opinion, is to state the main objective of all modern endeavors to be to enhance the subjective experience human beings are having of their own existence. With that stated objective and goal, there will be a litmus test, there will be a standard to measure your newness against the old or whatever other people are proposing to be new. If the old was better than what you're presenting or bringing about or trying to realize and replace the old with, then we need to keep the old because the old is enhancing our experience of existence better. From our perspective, this is better than what you're trying to replace it with, so we're going to go with this. And if you present us with something new, if you present us with something that is significantly better or even a little bit better from our perspective and our experience, then we're going to go with that. That would have been enough. It cannot be solely based on the individual. And this is what gets us to modernism's demise. The focus on the self, the focus on the individual, in the narrow view of reality. It was an inward turning. Instead of a objective reality, instead of an objective world out there, people turned inward and focused on an expression of the inward world in art, in literature, in many other areas. This is not sustainable if we're going to have a shareable community called a civilization or society. It was narrow. It was too narrow to be shareable. That's why no one could accept what people were doing as a broad truth. There was no commonality in the expression of much of the art. A pile of tuna cans wrapped in string and fishnet stockings may give a few people on this planet a positive aesthetic experience or evoke some emotion or response internally. But for most of us, it's likely to be seen as trash or nothing at all. This is what most of the modernists were doing, focusing solely on their inner state, on their inner world, what it's like for me, what it's like from my experience. But in no way was there any commonality, any foundation, any shared larger truth in what they were conveying from most of the modern period. Now, I'm not going to say this completely because I like modern art. I really do. I actually like this period of development. But without an adherence to some common shared human truth, something that is universal, when you express art, when you express your works of literature, music, or what have you, then there's no way for us to connect. Unless I'm specifically like you or moved in the way you are uniquely, then there's no way for me to really benefit from what you've done. It is a very selfish, personal pursuit. If there is no inclination or no thought or expectation that another person will see what you see or feel what you feel or be moved in any way, then it's not really giving. It is you doing whatever you want to do for you. And then there's a lot of social grandstanding, a lot of navel gazing and putting on and fronting and caking and capping or whatever you want to call it about how people are seeing things that they're not actually seeing in the art, in the music, in the literature. Modernism could have worked, but it became too narrow to build a new reality. And new information, new experiences, new understandings will move us up off of this narrow foundation. It's like standing on the head of a pin. It's much easier to stand on firm ground than on a narrow point. It's just simple. Broaden it, widen it, and it becomes more stable and, in a sense, more true. We're really fortunate that we came to the understanding and the realization that the world is something that's supposed to support and benefit our lives, that we aren't literally existing solely to act as cogs in a machine for a world made for no one, apparently. If it doesn't benefit us, if it doesn't support and uplift us, then why does it exist? That is really the question that should always be asked. However, going forward, to build a new world or to make a better one cannot be done from a personal and individual standpoint. A multidisciplinary attack on the world will never work unless there's a common goal, a common agreement, a common objective. That was not had, and it failed. But we're going to get into postmodernism in the next video, the world that results from this period, the world that we find ourselves in currently. Let me know what you think about this, though. Either way, I appreciate you watching this one. I really hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching once again. You have a great day. See you on the next one. Take care. Later.